Alright, so we're about to jump into episode 9, Dark Horizons. No big intro, here we go. Oh. Okay, so some people like seeing the Q&A, some people don't, and because it is a large amount of time to be set aside for this, because of the length of time of this, I'm uploading this without doing any editing whatsoever, trying to get it all done in one shot. So that being said, what I'll do is I'll check out the actual story, and then I'll make a separate video for the Q&A, so, I'm not spending so much time sitting down. In any case, here we go. Scenes from Rogue One.
One whose path has taken a new turn is often initially disoriented. But as time passes, and the path continues steadily in its new direction, there is a tendency to believe that it will remain so forever. But such a turn does not always mean that the victim has lost, or that the victor has won. All warriors understand the need to face and defeat the enemy. Both aspects of the task can be challenging. Both can require thought, insight, and planning. But a warrior may forget that even the task of identifying the enemy can be difficult, and the cost of that failure can lead to catastrophe. Failures in any of those areas can cost unnecessary time and irreplaceable lives.
I don't know where that comes from, but if somebody could please enlighten me, that was a really good quote to start off an episode.
She entered, brazen as her station allowed, dressed in what Orion assumed to be her most comfortable naval uniform, and flanked by 4 of her guards, one of whom was the captain of that guard. She had all the bearing and air of a woman going into a war council, which was much as he had expected her to react. It was how the vast majority of Imperial officers of any branch—
I'm going to pause right here. One second. I'm going to try to close this the best I can. There we go. Cut out a little bit of the outside sound from the rest of the house. Alright, let's go.
behaved when he invited them to anything that wasn't strictly a war council. So when Admiral Rolla froze at the sight of him, he did not take it as a slight or insult, but as part of the due course. He was standing beside the table they were to share, a simple thing of wood and silver, wide enough to hold a hefty course between them, yet not so large as to wordlessly invite many more than 2 occupants, particularly with only 2 chairs being present. The room itself was an abandoned chapel, large enough to sit a few hundred, which made it pathetically small by comparison to what was standard. It was clearly in disuse, dusty, abandoned, with most of the pews cleared away, leaving a large expanse before the lectern where sat their modest table. The room was lit by torches, the lumen strips in the ceilings and walls either broken or subpar after so long without proper maintenance. 2 Space Marines accompanied Orion, his 2 most trusted honor guard, and while they were fully armed and armored, Orion, most notably, was not. He stood in a deep blue habit, tied about his waist with a golden tassel. On his chest stretched the imperial aquila, and his robe was lined with gilded thread. But outside of these details, his robe was plain, finely made, but certainly modest. She looked at him as though she had found him standing naked, and it was not lost on Orion that this was likely the first time she had ever seen a space marine unarmored, and likely it would be the only time she ever saw someone of his rank in such a state. But Orion prided himself on his tactical deployment of humility, a weapon all too accessible, yet too often neglected by the men of his order. In response to her expression, he gave the barest hint of a smile and pulled her chair out, gesturing towards it. Rolla nodded to her guards, and Orion knew from the slight pause which followed that she had given them orders. They departed, moving to the four corners of the room to create a perimeter, while Orion's honor guard backed away enough to not be intrusive, but remained at either side of their chapter master. As she came forward to take a seat, he crossed over to his own seat, a much larger chair made to accommodate his size. Once she sat, Lord Admiral Rolla looked across at Orion. Her face was a mask of cordial neutrality, something he knew she could fake readily, thanks to her augmentations, which also provided her with the beauty of a much younger creature. "Ah, Lord Admiral Rolla, I'm glad that you could meet me here for this small dinner. It is not often that I am afforded the privilege of dining with the Lord Admiral of the sector herself," he said. She raised an eyebrow in response. "I see. I'm sure it will not surprise you to know that I have never had the privilege of dining alongside an Astartes, much less one of such a profound rank and seniority. I do not expect that such an event comes lightly or without cause." Orion nodded. "Indeed, there is a great cause to our meeting here," Orion admitted. "But I am sincere when I say it is a privilege. I worked closely with your predecessor for a time, before the Battle of Uxinil's Heart. He and I would often meet like this during the retaliation wars." This was a lie. Orion had worked closely with the previous Lord Admiral, and they had dined in this very place. Twice. But only once on purpose, and only once like they were doing now. Still, he could see it taking the truth just that much farther, could see the very slight, nearly imperceptible changes in her movements as she lifted the menu resting before her. "I can imagine how that might be the case. Lord Admiral Bosun was reputed to have been an incredible man," she said as her eyes drifted across the lettering. "And I have every reason, after reading about your account on Kentalis, to believe that you will be just as capable," Orion said, lifting his own menu as well. Her eyes trembled. She didn't read the last word, he knew. She had skipped it as the impact of his words took her. Yes, he knew about Kentalis, long before she had even been a proper admiral, an early showing of her promise as a commanding officer in the Navy, yet something that would go unmentioned throughout most of her accolades. It was something that could only be found after it was sought, and no casual seeking would have uncovered it. "I see you know much of me," she said casually. She placed her menu down gently, folding her hands together and looking at Orion as he mirrored the movement. "And I know much of you as well, Orion Phaedrus. Your record is formidable, even compared to others among your ascended kind. Simply that you are the most senior of all of the commanders from between 3 chapters of Astartes speaks volumes without utterance. But the work you did on Jubilation of Tau, Gargantua 9, and Yevan Secundus, masterful." He nodded, not denying her. Of course, he knew what she was implying. All 3 of those worlds had faced insurrections, and all 3 had to be restructured extensively. He himself had been forced to intervene in each of these conflicts, not simply to root out the traitors and insurrectionists, but to repair the severely corrupted and decayed power structures that had been uncovered there. "I am glad that you appreciate the care my chapter takes in ensuring the loyalty and stability of the Emperor's dominion."
So basically, this is him attempting to establish a power base. This is Ultramarines.
"I expect you would do no less in my position." She smiled at that, though it was not a kind smile. Of course, we must all do what we can as our duties demand, and yet, forgive me for saying so, but many may consider such duties to fall under the purview of the Inquisition. Others who are less dedicated or daring may even consider it an overreach of your authority. Orion felt his eye desire to twitch, but smothered the impulse. Discipline was his greatest weapon, and he was never unarmed. Still, he had to commend the Lord Admiral. She had a way of cutting to the point with a touchless blade. Lord Admiral, do you know much of the Cascani insurrection of Yevan Secundus? He asked. A servitor entered the room then, clicking and clacking on metal limbs like a four-legged insect. It came to each of them in turn, taking their orders and writing them down precisely before scuttling away again. When this was done, Rolla turned to answer the chapter master's question. I was referring to the Prokin rebellion, actually, she said. Yes, I suspected you were. But do you know of this prior event? He pressed. I'm afraid not, she said. Orion leaned back in his chair. I was a battle brother then, a tactical marine. My whole squad of 10 had been sent to Yevan Secundus to put down a heretical insurrection. Rebels, worshipping some kind of fertility god, had started capturing and sacrificing members of the nobility, as well as sabotaging off-world grain shipments.
Nice.
He sighed heavily, and though he desired the impression it gave off, this was no feint. The memory weighed heavily on him.
Okay, so if you're from Star Wars watching this and you're trying to understand why the Imperium is the way it is, it's because this is how they've had to be for an extremely long time, to the point where it's become second nature to do some of the things that they do. When you hear, oh, they started worshiping a fertility goddess, well, you know, then all of a sudden you hear they started sacrificing people. That's not uncommon. That's just not uncommon. These things start off small. That's how chaos corruption works. Chaos corrupts to the point where something as innocuous as, let's just give this, let's say, thanks be to Mithra for, and I know Mithra is a D&D deity, but you get the point. Thanks to Mithra for this, or something like that. Once it's named, it starts taking on a life of its own. And before long, you have sacrifices, you have, like blood counts, you have body counts going through the stratosphere, and then it just turns into a huge mess. So, and it happens, and it's a slow boiling kind of thing, where most of the people that are on a planet don't realize what's happening underneath their feet until it erupts in violence and just utter carnage. And that's how that works. So if you're wondering why certain things happen the way that they do in 40K, it's because 40K is a universe of extremes. And by extremes, I do mean radical extremes. But in any case, moving on.
It had truth and the power of truth in it. So we found them. We killed most of them, took their leaders prisoner. It was easy. A near complete waste of our time. He said, Why capture their leaders? The Lord Admiral asked. Orion smiled a sad smile. It was the real reason we were there. My chapter didn't care if this planet lost a few grain shipments, or if a few haughty nobles were eaten alive on a planet-wide vidcast. The reason my chapter responded was because these heretics, they were killing in the name of a god, a foul, unknown god, and we needed to root it out.
There you go.
He could see in her posture, though not in her face, that she didn't quite understand. You see, Lord Admiral, rarely, I mean truly rarely, is it the case that an insurrection purports to worship a god of any kind and is in truth worshipping nothing. Normally it is some kind of Xeno or charismatic rogue psyker, or worse. It was this thing that we were hunting, and so we took their leaders prisoner in order to interrogate them, to force them to reveal the location of their gods. Orion shook his head. They did. On the first night, in the first hour, they told us. We did not believe them, and I personally aided the chaplains in forcing them through every single measure and method of truth extraction that they could survive. And yet, when they lay broken and chittering at the end, the answer was the same, and it was a terrible answer. She leaned in, and he continued. There was no God. They made it up, he said simply. The Lord Admiral blinked. Well, that hardly seems so terrible, she said. Does it? He asked, his voice heavy and serious. Think about it, Lord Admiral. Orion continued. Normally, it takes some kind of alien parasite, or psychic tyrant, or spiritual corruption to taint mankind against the Emperor, to make them renounce his laws, and his will, and their own faith in him, to side with something else. It normally requires a display of power, or a promise of true reward. But when we finished our interrogations, we were left with a mundane but horrendous reality. These men had been hungry and angry. They had watched their children die. They watched their wives waste away and their brothers and sisters pass into the grave pointlessly. The men and women of the Imperium are always willing to sacrifice for the Emperor, but it must be for him, for something.
Right.
But the High King of Yevan Secundus starved and ruined his people day by day, year by year, out of sheer negligence and incompetence. So great was the menace of his own administration that he was the source of this profane god. He compelled it into existence, for it was only through the use of this made-up entity that the rebels could fight him. And they fought him rightly. The words were like balls of hard ice being thrown directly into the Admiral's face. How can you say that? Serving the planetary governor is serving the... Yevan Secundus produced nothing, Orion interjected. What it shipped out was always dwarfed by the expense of what it shipped in.
Right.
The world had once been an agri-world until the High King and his line, drunk on delusions of grandeur, attempted to convert the planet into a hive. He had no plan, barely enough resources to attempt the lunacy of his design, and no consideration for his existing infrastructure. He destroyed his planet, destroyed his people, and was content to let his whole world choke. 3 half-built hives and a ruined system of grain farms, all he had to show for it, and everything he was willing to settle for. And because of that, the people of his expiring world served nothing but the indulgence of their High King's utter lack of fitness. Rolus and Durin nodded, her movement sympathetic and genuine. So you left the first time, she concluded. Orion laughed. We shot him, he said. We shot him, and his son, and his 2 daughters. Painless deaths. Better than he deserved. So, what exactly is the point of this story? Rolla asked. Orion leaned in this time. The High Queen remarried. Her new husband became the new High King, and his son their successor. When me and my chapter were forced to return during the Procan Rebellion, everything was somehow worse. This time, the fight was not easy. This time, an entire company, 100 of us, not 10, were needed to bring the world back into order. And this time, 3 of my brothers, 3, died on that planet. True anger began to resonate into his voice now, and he didn't attempt to restrain it. Brother Tascairn Chold, Brother Sasran Olden, and Apothecary Julian Vrain. 480 years of combat experience between them, and they died killing desperate, starving humans who had been driven so far out of their senses by their conditions that they dared to rebel. The old Space Marine shook his head. It was there and then where I realized that it was not enough to merely excise the infection. The wound needed to be bandaged, rested, and healed. So this time we shot them all, the High King, the High Queen, and their entire family lines. I created trials, tests, and took those who succeeded and mentored them briefly in the ways of rulership, in the ways of administration. We taught them to stand, and then we let them stand. I am no tetrarch. I do not aspire to be one. The reason Yevan Secundus still has a High King is because I still insisted on respecting the structure that was already there, that which could be salvaged. As I was then, I am now. He paused briefly as the half-mechanical servant placed a dish of spiced void eels before the Lord Admiral, all artfully displayed, each wide mouth filled with a candied centurion apricot. He resumed after his own dish. A steaming bowl of something blue and very hot was set down. It smelled like
roasted towel?
Like wet plaster, and somehow left a metallic sting in the Admiral's nostrils.
Roasted towel.
So then, I can assume that, since you are now as you were then, you are eyeing the power structure of our isolated forces. Is that right? She asked, picking up her utensils and cutting into the supple flesh of the first eel. Perhaps I would be, if one existed, Orion said. But if we are no longer abiding by the rules of commander seniority, then there is none. There is no Imperium here. What there is an aging battle fleet, 3 Space Marine chapters, many extremely varied regiments of the Imperial Guard, several overloaded black ships full of volatile psychers, and thousands of transports housing almost 15 planets worth of civilians who will all soon be arriving at this system. There is no Departamento Munitorum. There is no Segmentum Command. There is no Terra, no Astronomicon, no High Lords. There is just us, and soon there will not even be that. The Lord Admiral wanted to protest, wanted to refute his statements, but she couldn't. Not while he was looking at her, not when she had no way of refuting his words without resorting to delusion. He could see it in her artificial eyes, still too human to hide her soul underneath. Then, what do you want from me? Command of the fleet? Command of the transports? She asked sarcastically. He didn't take her bait, didn't flinch as he proceeded. Work with me, Lord Admiral. Stand with me, not under me, but alongside me. Put your trust and your weight behind my chapter in the negotiations to come. The Imperium is not here until we make it here. Help me do that. The Lord Admiral stared into his burning golden eyes for several long moments, judging him, his words, his worth, and his loyalty. And that was as it should be. After all, he had done the same before ever meeting her. Ultimately, her response was a heavy sigh as she placed her fork down, a juicy chunk of pitch-black eel flesh still attached to the end. I will agree to hear you out, she said. Orion smiled, but suppressed most of it, restraining his expression to a subtle grin as he nodded, lifting his own spoon and dipping it into the bubbling concoction before him. He had her, even if she didn't want to realize it then. Already she agreed with him, and now the rest was merely a matter of social formality. Thank you. That is all that I can ask.
There it goes.
The room was simple, circular, its tiled walls and glossy stone floors a perfect model of Rothanian minimalist architecture and design. The only pieces of furniture present within the room were a large white pentagonal holotable at its center and the plethora of comfortable rotating chairs placed around it. Despite them all being in attendance, most of the chairs were empty. There were not many that Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Mace had judged worthy of being considered as competent advisors. First among those few they had recognized was Anakin himself. He sat beside Captain Rex and Echo, the latter of whom had recently been promoted to full commando and was thereby representing Clone Force 99 at this meeting. Directly across from Anakin and the clones was Dr. Sheena, who sat in a levitating mobile chair, her legs still locked within a cast, though she seemed to be otherwise recovering swiftly. Sitting to her right was a straight-backed Captain Spikes, who wore the uniform of a naval officer, having even gone so far as to remove his helmet from the ensemble.
Okay, so I'm really interested to see what this is going to be, because this is going to be the reaction of the arrival. I'm not going to call it an invasion, because an invasion goes a little bit differently. The arrival of the Imperium into the Star Wars universe.
To Dr. Sheena's left sat Bucket, who wore his white trooper armor and helm and slouched like he was facing a court-martial.
Bucket.
Additionally, sitting to Bucket's left was a newcomer. Admiral Wilhelm Tarkin, who had arrived only hours before, looked down his nose at the rest of the room.
There's somebody that's name bears the lip. Now, if you're from 40K and you don't know about Tarkin, let me dissuade anything. Tarkin isn't one of... Tarkin got a raw deal in Episode 4. Tarkin got a raw deal because Tarkin was an exceptional military commander. The only one that surpasses him would be Thrawn. And if there's one Star Wars admiral that I think could pose a serious problem to the Imperium coming into the Star Wars universe, whose name isn't Tarkin, it's Thrawn. It's a toss-up between who is better. In any case, now this gets interesting for me.
Room with his one good eye. The man wore a sling, a still bloody bandage obscuring his left eye, and white medical burn patches dotted his chin and neck. He was now a veteran of the retreat at Axum, which was quickly coming to be known by the galactic community as the Blue Massacre. Presiding over them, as assessors, were Jedi Masters Mace Windu and Obi-Wan Kenobi. It was their duty to determine what effect this emergency meeting of theirs would have. We know that all of you have a lot of experience to bring to this conversation, and a lot of ideas as to what direction would be most productive, so we'll begin there, said Obi-Wan. Each of you will be given some time to state what you think is the most important issue to address, and why. Rest assured, we will address all of these issues, but it will be up to me, Master Obi-Wan, and the Supreme Chancellor to determine in what order these problems are to be addressed. Keeping that in mind, I think we will start with young Skywalker and move around the table clockwise. Mace added. Objections? He asked. None were raised. Good. Then Skywalker, please begin. Anakin stood up from his chair. His face was fierce, but controlled. We lost 27 Jedi, including Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, in the retreat from Axum. Nearly all of them were killed in personal combat with these, Astartes, General. Thank you, Echo. Astartes. And I know why. I realized it while fighting the one I encountered over Anaxis. They're fast and strong, much faster and stronger physically than any droid or even Sith that we have been made to face. So naturally, when I began fighting him, I treated him as I would a Sith or Jedi combatant. The moment I did that, I began to lose badly. Because they aren't Force sensitives, Obi-Wan said, the revelation mixing awe into his voice as he spoke. Wait, Mace interjected. Do you mean to tell me these Astartes are managing these feats entirely without the aid of the Force? Hard to believe, I know, but we need to start believing it, start training the remaining Jedi against it. These new warriors are not using precognition to guide their strikes, and trying to preempt them that way will only allow them to catch you by surprise again and again until you recognize what you are facing. We need to fight them the way that we fight Magna Guards and Commando Droids, but with a few alterations. There are certain forms that we cannot use against these enemies. Their swords are heavy, and they have more than enough power to move and leverage them with ease. Parries and blocks using Makashi won't compensate well. It could mean instant death. Additionally, the Gem So won't work either. They're faster and stronger than us. We cannot overcome their physical strength and speed consistently, and without that, aggressive forms cannot hold. I think Anakin was cut short as Mace raised his hand. You have made your point, Skywalker, but your time is up. What is your suggestion? Anakin barely restrained a glare, but sighed and continued. What I'm suggesting is that we need to retrain the Jedi Order as a whole to deal with these new enemies. If we don't, then we're just going to continue losing knights. With that, Anakin sat down, and the turn passed.
This makes sense from the way that Mace viewed Anakin up, and it really does. It's annoying, but in the same fashion that it was annoying in the movies and the actual media. Mace didn't respect Anakin's opinion all that much, it seems. Or thought he was being a little bit too wordy. But yeah.
Over to Captain Rex. The clone stood, dressed in his customized blue-tinted armor, his helmet placed on the table before him. Permission to speak freely, generals? He asked. Granted, said both Obi-Wan and Anakin. He coughed to clear his throat. I do not mean to dismiss the weapons given to us by the Republic. They have worked well against the clankers and the militia that the Separatists have been throwing at us. So what I'm going to say may seem hard to believe, but it needs to be said, and I believe it needs to be acted on right away. Rex pulled his left blaster pistol out of its holster and slid it onto the table. We need better guns. To further punctuate his point, the clone pressed a button on the side of his helmet, sending its data to the holotable, which promptly displayed said data as a three-dimensional blue image. It was the Space Marine they had been fighting, viewed from Rex's perspective. The assembled experts, clones, and Jedi watched as Rex, Tech, Hunter, and then Wrecker, after he had finished reloading, unloaded a torrent of lethal blue bolts into the large yet defiantly nimble form of the Astartes. More than half of the bolts were deflected, and yet several got past the warrior's guard. The blue bolts splashed and hissed against his armor, landing in volleys that would have downed super battle droids. But against the Space Marine, they seemed to do only superficial damage. Then the image changed, displaying an altered HUD as they watched from Crosshair's point of view, the scene a twisting, confusing mess before it halted abruptly with a view of the Astartes' bloody face, which lasted all of a millisecond before Crosshair blew it away. The Marine's eyes popped like grapes. Burning skin flayed off his skull by the high-energy particles of the shot, revealing the resilient bones underneath. The image then fast-forwarded to the moment when the Astartes, little more than a smoldering skull atop armor at this point, sat up. The image froze. I don't know how or why, but energy blasts and ion bolts are not cutting it. Our EMP grenades would likely do very little damage to them as well. These are clearly not droids. We need weapons that can kill these things with a headshot, or better yet, weapons that can penetrate that armor.
Okay, so I read a comment that asked basically, well, that was saying basically talking about the EMP from the blasters. Now, I don't know where that comes from. I don't know. I'd love to see a source on that because I like learning about other universes more than I already know. But at the same time, even if there was an EMP from the blasters, it would take something exceptionally strong to knock out Astartes plate for any length of time. Astartes plate is hardened against nuclear blasts. So, there you go.
He pressed the same button on his helmet and disconnected the feed, turning the image off. We needed them at Pazab. We needed them at Anaxis, and we're going to need them worse and worse the longer we don't have them. So my suggestion is simple. We get them, invent them, buy them. It doesn't matter, but we get them ASAP and get them in the hands of the troops fast. That should be our most immediate concern. Thank you, Rex, said Obi-Wan, giving him a nod as the clone sat back down. Next was Captain Spikes. He stood up, formal, straight, holding a datapad in his right hand. He pressed something on its surface and a holovid began to play on the table. It was a view of the Freedom, mere seconds before it had been destroyed. It began firing at something out of sight, tilting to angle more turbo lasers at it, but that didn't last long. Like a god's cruel knife, a large outsider ship drove into view, its blade-like prow absorbing the brief spurts of concentrated fire the Freedom had managed to throw at it before plunging into the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The arrowhead form of the Republic cruiser was split down the center, both sides buckling upward around the wedge-like head of the enemy ship. Fire and debris spilled from the struck craft like clouds of stellar gore, stirred and split suddenly when the colossal broadside guns of the enemy ship fired, the hollow view panning back somewhat to show the shots ripping 2 more Venators into pieces. Then the vid ended, and instead a tactical display was put up in its place. It revealed the battle in time-lapse. The enemy ships were represented as red dots of various sizes, and friendly vessels were similar but blue and smaller. As the sterile information displayed a virtual mirror of the carnage they had just seen prior, Captain Spikes began to speak. Our turbo lasers cannot reach the enemy. They lose too much power and travel too slowly over the vacuum to engage at the ranges they are using. Despite that, it appears their ships enjoy engaging in ramming maneuvers. Once in effective range, our weapons do work, but not as well as their armaments. In a straight shootout, they can outlast us. And then there's the issue of size. He tapped his datapad again, displaying one of their ships, a 5-kilometer-long dreadnought. It had gotten itself surrounded by Venators and Class C frigates. They had mauled through its shields, but clearly that wasn't enough. They poured fire into it, but it wasn't dying. The enemy ships can get so large that it becomes hard for captains like me to imagine where to even concentrate fire with a weapon like a turbo laser. Proton torpedoes, concussion missiles, basically anything that explodes, these have been shown to be more effective, and still their payloads aren't packing enough for a decisive victory. He turned off the display, setting the datapad down on the desk. In short, the fleet needs to be rearmed, refitted, and redeployed. How and with what, I cannot pretend to know. As it is now, we will bleed tens of ships for each one of theirs that we can take down, and I might be being generous. This needs to be changed before anything else can get done. The Jedi won't have to fight the Astartes, and neither will the clones, if we can just fight off the relatively few ships they do have. We need—
Thank you, Captain. Your recommendation is received.
Mace interjected. Spikes paused, nodded once, and sat down. Dr. Sheena frowned as all eyes moved on to her. Pass, she said, her voice weary. Come on now, I'm sure you've got some kind of suggestion for us, Obi-Wan prompted. She sighed, straightening in her seat. Get the Senate and the Chancellor, all of them, put them on a Mandator 2 dreadnought, and make it the new capital of the Republic, the doctor said. Every eye went wide. Just like that? Obi-Wan pressed. She sighed again, more heavily, ample brow creasing. Look, I'm just being realistic.
This I have to disagree with her on. The Imperium cannot move fast enough to do this, like what she's concerned about. She's concerned about a headshot decapitating the government. I understand that with what she's seen, I understand, but the Imperium isn't capable of doing this right now. They know nothing about this, and even if they did, they would view it as a waste of resources and like a potential terrible idea to actually run into there like that.
The amount of advantages we have over the enemy are finite, extremely finite, but also extremely, extreme. From all the data I have, every single thing I have been able to examine, it seems that their form of FTL travel does not abide or become impeded by mass shadows. I do not know if this is because they can somehow go through them without colliding with them, or because they can maneuver around them while remaining in hyperspace. The point is, they could go from anywhere to anywhere. Maybe this isn't true. Maybe there are other things which divert and impede them that I simply do not know about yet. But if it is true, she said, trailing off, then we won't be able to keep them out of the core. Or off of Coruscant by holding hyperspace lanes, Anakin concluded. Dr. Sheena snapped her fingers. Exactly. Give the angry one a prize. Any moment now they could be departing from the Axum system straight to Coruscant, and we wouldn't be able to stop them, but we would still be able to beat them there.
What do you mean? Mace asked.
They are slow, Dr. Sheena said.
Yes.
Their FTL technology is much, much slower than even what a cheap commercial hyperdrive can provide.
Yes.
They're unstoppable, but not inescapable. We cannot save Coruscant, but we can save the Republic.
By effectively abandoning our traditional seat of power and going into exile, Mace said, his tone suggesting that he was not a fan of the prospect. Dr. Sheena shrugged. I've made my suggestion. Windu nodded and all eyes slid from the doctor to her companion, the clone trooper Bucket. I think I'll pass. I'm not really here because I'm a good he started to say. Oh, no, you don't. They made me be constructive, so you better say something, or I'll never let you off this assignment.
Nice.
Dr. Sheena snapped. The clone groaned loudly, putting his helmed head in his hands before standing. Okay, so I'm CT-7226, but my friends call me Bucket because I once got my head stuck in my helmet for almost 2 months and he said, trailing off for a moment as all watched on.
Right.
Well, anyway, story for another time, I guess. I didn't really fight them. None boarded our ship, and I'm a trooper, not a pilot or bridge crew. But I do know this. We were headless for a good while there. Some commanders, like Captain Spikes, took control right away, but a lot of us were sort of left floundering. I don't know if that helps, but I feel like we would have done way more damage if any of us had known what we were doing. Exactly, said Tarkin, standing up and speaking for the first time. Bucket gratefully sat back down as Tarkin continued. We've all seen the reports. We've all seen how first contact with these hostile outsiders was carried out, and that is to say, abysmally.
Yes.
And while I mean no disrespect to those assembled here, I feel compelled to go further. Tarkin turned to face Anakin then. You did perhaps the best in this example. You and your team managed to shut down the droid army, recovering intelligence along the way, and managed to self-extract despite unforeseen complications. But you did not retrieve the enemy's body, nor his weapon for examination. You did not take him captive when he was all but disabled. Anakin frowned, but Tarkin did not entertain his glare, moving now to look at Mace Windu and Obi-Wan. And you two were in charge of the forces defending Anaxis. You chose to retreat in place of contending the ground. Retreat from Anaxis, the site of the most prestigious war college in the Republic, as well as the site of the Azerite shipyards, which were being used to resupply and construct our reserve fleets. All of this despite the enemy not even physically being there to contest the area. These outsiders had control of a planet-cracking bomb, Obi-Wan protested. What would you have done? Remained and risked losing the war for the Republic? Tarkin shook his head and sighed. It did not even occur to you, because of where your minds are, or rather, where they aren't. The tactical thing to do would have been to retreat 85% of ground forces to high orbit. The 15% who remained would be tasked with holding the production facilities. The enemy would not have destroyed all of Anaxis and its production resources to defeat that number. They would have gone down and engaged our forces on the ground.
They would have.
Once the enemy committed forces, then you could safely and gradually commit more of our forces to hold our territory. The enemy would not detonate their weapon while their own soldiers are present on the planet, and that would buy us
You don't know the Imperium very well, but I do get his tactics.
time to neutralize it without losing the Republic's holdings. And what if the enemy commander decided that 15% of our forces was enough to warrant the bomb going off? Obi-Wan asked. The haggard admiral shrugged casually. Then we lose 15% of our forces at Anaxis and deny the enemy what we have lost. Still a better outcome than what we have now.
Exactly.
And as if to prove my point, I myself have just come from an utter disaster of a defense that your now deceased colleague, Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, orchestrated. Pazab, Anaxis, and now Axum. We will continue to lose worlds if we do not finally address, once and for all, the wrath in the room, Tarkin asserted. And what wrath is that precisely? Mace Windu asked. That the Jedi Knights and the Jedi Order as a whole are not suited to the task of leading this war.
Bingo! Bingo! I never understood why the Jedi were put in charge of the clone troopers. I never got that. I never really understood that. It should have been actual military personnel put in charge of the clone troopers, with the Jedi there as support and specialists. But instead they were given direct command, which it doesn't translate.
You are not trained for it, you are not ideologically predisposed to it, and despite the experience you have all gained in these past 4 years, you are not mentally prepared for the realities of command. Mace Windu waved his hand dismissively. These sound like concerns you should address to the Supreme Chancellor, he said. As you well know, I have, multiple times. The Supreme Chancellor seems to be quite convinced of your competence, despite the evidence. So, as much as I would prefer this be handled by the Chancellor's better judgment, I am forced to rely on your judgment instead. Obi-Wan leaned in, fingers folding. So just what are you proposing,
he
Admiral?
looks kind of crazy in this picture.
Tarkin looked around for a moment, imperious, straight as a blade, and just as humorless. I am recommending that the Jedi Order as a whole step down. Abdicate command of the Republic's armies voluntarily, and allow true military leaders to take control of this war effort. Return to your temples, or enlist to serve properly, but recognize that you are not fit to confront this new enemy, not as you are now.
No.
He paused, retrieving a data pad of his own from the surface of the...
You see, that's not an insult to the Jedi as they are. I mean, they were good enough commanders for fighting a droid army, which was led just about as poorly as the other army. But with the caliber of the troops they had at their disposal, which the clone troopers are very, very good. But at the same time, they were not equipped for this. It's just like he was saying. They weren't trained for it. They're ideologically opposed to warfare. It's just not a good fit.
The table. No one spoke, and so he pressed on. It does not need to happen all at once, though it could. Our current military structure allows for that kind of rapid reorganization of officers. Slow or fast, gradual or immediate, I have compiled a list of suitably trained and experienced leaders from within the Republic's member worlds. They are loyal, tactical, and most importantly, ruthlessly pragmatic. I have matched them purposefully to each command posting that is currently held by a Jedi commander. As he spoke, the holotable displayed his list in 2 columns. In the right one, names, birth dates, achievements, and current ranks. In the left, faces to match each profile, showing a myriad of species, organizations, and ages. We already know we're going to need to make sweeping changes to contend with this newest threat. If those changes do not begin at the top, then we have little hope of correcting this course before it leads to our eventual defeat and the collapse of all order in the galaxy, Tarkin said. When he finished, he sat back down, not waiting to be acknowledged or dismissed by the Jedi. A silence began then that lasted for many uncomfortable seconds before it was broken by an even more uncomfortable statement. You're all wrong. Echo stood then and began to speak. With all due respect, none of this is what we should be focusing on now, he asserted. Training the Jedi to fight the Astartes, rearming the troops, rearming the fleets, all of that will take time, too much time. Even if we had all the weapons ready, the refits waiting to be applied, a perfect new lightsaber form to counteract the way they fight, even then it would all still take weeks or months to deploy it. Echo shook his head sadly. And we just don't have time. Replacing the Jedi won't make that any different, and the last thing we need right now is to scramble our command structure. Reordering while trying to fight off being eaten alive just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The only suggestion I can really say that I agree with is the doctor's suggestion. At least hers can be implemented right now. But what are you yourself suggesting? Mace asked. Echo paused to think. I think we need help. We need to contact the Separatists. We need to work something out. A ceasefire or temporary alliance. Something that will at least stop us from fighting a war on 2 fronts. But the best case would be if we could combine our forces against them. If it were possible for Echo to have said anything more shocking than what Tarkin had already suggested, he seemed to have just given voice to it. Echo, that's... Anakin started. Look, I know what I look like. I'm basically standing here, half-droid myself, Echo shouted. I know that some of you wonder if you can trust me because of all this, he said, gesturing at himself. But please, Believe me when I tell you this. I hate droids. I hate being part droid. I've been fighting clankers my entire life, and them stringing me up like a puppet hasn't lessened any of those feelings. But I feel something even more strongly now. Echo reached forward to the base of the holotable's projector, plugging his augmented arm into the interface. I'm afraid, he said, as some of the images he had been forced to see were fed into the display. Scenes depicting otherworldly monsters began to slide by, one after another. Some were among a swarm of their kin, blood-stained talons and claws forming a veritable bestial ocean before their eyes. Others were singular, standing atop hideous altars, viscera and corpses draping them like raiments of rulership. 12 images total. What are we looking at, Echo? Anakin asked, though he found his eyes couldn't look away. This was part of the information I was able to slip out of Brother Taslian when Tech was breaking me out of the Separatist computers. As far as I can tell, they are image captures from his helmet. They were technically deleted, but the data hadn't been overwritten yet. I've sorted through it and cleaned them up a bit, but what you're seeing, it's what they see. It's what they fight. Echo shook his head, the movement unnervingly despondent. I also got other things. Communication snips, some random statistics on some of the equipment that this man had equipped before. Generals, I'm afraid because none of the data I can understand tells me anything good. And because, while I was grabbing anything I could from the less protected parts of his system, he was doing the same thing to me, but better, more directly. He knows where Coruscant is. He knows what the Republic is. He knows that we are at war. He knows that we are led by the Jedi, that they can use the Force. Yes, Echo, that was in your report, Mace said sternly. Echo nodded stiffly but straightened, not sitting down. Then, respectfully, General, you need to realize that the second their fleet... At that moment, Echo was interrupted again, but not by Mace Windu. The door into the smooth room suddenly swung open, a disheveled Rothonian man entering. Generals! His voice was trembling, the stoic composure of his culture breached by whatever information he needed to relay. The outsider fleet has just arrived in the Arcanus sector. Everyone jolted at that. How is that possible? I wasn't even aware the outsiders had left the Axum system, Rex said. It's not that fleet, sir. It's the first fleet. The second fleet... That cannot be possible either. What system? Dr. Sheena almost yelled. The aide stuttered for a moment before managing an answer. It's not an important system. Only a single inhabited planet. Extremely low population index. The tattoo system, I think it was called. But it's sitting at the crossroads of the Trialist trade route and the old Corellian-run hyperspace route. We fear this might signal the beginning of a substantial new blockading effort. Dr. Sheena shook her head, eyes wide in abject denial. They left 4 days ago. There's no way they could have reached this far into the Arcanus sector this quickly. The Rothanian didn't seem to know what...
Technically, they could, if the warp was placid. Now, they still wouldn't have they still wouldn't hold a candle to hyperspace. It would not happen, because you can travel from one end of the galaxy to the other in a remarkably short time going through hyperspace. But with the warp, the warp in the Star Wars universe being placid, it would enable much faster transit times than would normally be allowed.
To say to her, "See, this is what I'm talking about," Echo said, leaning one hand against the table as he gestured with his interface tool towards the aide. We think we know things, but we don't. We're drawing lines, trying to pretend that what we think we know amounts to anything. Maybe hyperdrives are faster, maybe only sometimes. That's why we can't pull punches right now. We need to stop fighting the Separatists. We need to pull everything we have together and then some. The moment their fleet leaves the Axum system, they are going straight to Coruscant, and if they do, we don't know how much time we will actually have. Sirs? The aide interjected again, his pale skin now much, much paler. I was also told to inform you that the Second Fleet has just departed the Axum system. They left the small reserve force around Axum and Anaxis, but most of the fleet departed the system approximately 8 minutes ago.
The news was like an ice bath on every ear that heard it.
Also, another massive advantage that Star Wars would have over 40K is communication. 40K's interplanetary communication is horrifically outclassed by everything in Star Wars. Flat out. It's absolutely laughable, the difference between 40K's communication interstellarly and Star Wars' communication.
For a brief instant, no more than a tenth of a second, all were too struck to respond. But this was no longer the first year of the Clone Wars. "Prepare a shuttle. We leave in the hour," Mace Windu said. "Yes, Master Jedi," said the aide. "Contact the Chancellor. Make a formal request to recall the fleets back to Coruscant on my behalf," said Admiral Tarkin. "Right away, Admiral," the aide added, coming to the table and withdrawing a datapad from his robe-like garment, beginning to take notes. "Also, try to see if you cannot secure a line of communication with the Separatist Council," said Obi-Wan. This had many eyes darting his way, but he raised a hand to assuage them before any words were spoken. "Nothing is decided, but we might as well keep our options open," he said. His former Padawan rolled his eyes at that. "Right, we might as well call up Death Watch while we're at it," said Anakin, standing and heading for the door. Obi-Wan shook his head, but did not rise to his bait. Rex donned his helmet, and he, as well as the other clones, began to move without being told, with the exception of Bucket, who had to be ordered to follow by the Doctor. But just before they left, the aide asked one more question. Admiral, which fleets?" "Pardon?" asked Tarkin.
All of them.
"Which fleets do you want recalled? From which fronts?" Tarkin shook his head. "I would have thought that to be obvious. All of them, boy. Request all of them."
Those eyes, man. Those eyes. Alright. So, tomorrow I'm going to watch the Q&A session for this. And then I'll see if I can't watch the next episode past it. But for now, that's it for this one. Unfortunately, it's a 48-minute long video. I'll hopefully have it uploaded tonight, but probably not. And I apologize, but it is what it is. This is getting really interesting. I want to see how the Republic actually... Palpatine's going to go Imperial just to centralize power in the face of this threat. And I don't, even though he was planning to do it to begin with, I wouldn't blame anybody for being like, save us! Because, frankly, a threat like this doesn't go away. 40K is a rolling juggernaut, and you have to take what advantages that you have and utilize in the best way that you can. In any case, I'll see you guys next time.